Imagine an empire, devout and glorious, turning its wrath not on external foes, but upon its own most cherished sacred art. For over a century, in the heart of Byzantium, this unimaginable purge became a brutal reality. Here, on Echoes of Time, we delve into a chapter of history not merely forgotten, but actively erased. A clandestine saga known as Iconoclasm. This is Byzantium's purged past, unearthing the forbidden history of iconoclasm, a journey into the heart of a theological and political firestorm that ripped through one of history's most enduring empires. The very notion defies belief. How could an empire so rich in artistic and religious devotion, so deeply intertwined with the sacred imagery that permeated every facet of its existence, systematically destroy the very icons it once revered? What compelled them to shatter mosaics, whitewash frescoes, and burn holy paintings that had inspired generations? This is the central, haunting enigma that lies beneath the dust of centuries, a story that never quite made it cleanly into the history books, shrouded in the silence of shattered devotion and imperial decree. It is a period of intense religious strife, imperial power struggles, and profound cultural transformation that scarred the Byzantine world from the early 8th century with the decrees of Emperor Leo III, through to the final restoration of icons in 843 AD. Over 100 years of conflict where the line between piety and destruction blurred, and the definition of sacred itself was violently contested. The initial tremors of this unprecedented war on images began with Emperor Leo III, whose pronouncements in the early 8th century unleashed forces that would reshape the empire. No longer were icons mere devotional objects, they became battlegrounds. The term iconoclasm itself, meaning image breaking, perfectly encapsulates the systematic, brutal efficiency with which this policy was enforced. From grand cathedrals to humble monasteries, from imperial palaces to private homes, the agents of the state, often backed by theological arguments, began to dismantle centuries of artistic heritage. This was not a spontaneous act of mob fury, but a calculated, widespread campaign that demanded obedience and conformity, altering the very visual landscape of the empire. Traditional explanations for this radical shift often point to a renewed emphasis on spiritual purity, a powerful rejection of what was perceived as idolatry. Scholars frequently cite early Christian aniconic traditions, the belief that God is beyond depiction, a principle that predated the widespread use of religious images, as a possible historical precedent. Furthermore, the intellectual and theological ferment of the era, possibly influenced by external pressures and the interpretations of faith in neighboring cultures like Islam, which strictly prohibited graven images, is often brought forward as a contributing factor. Yet, as with so many seemingly straightforward historical narratives, the true motives behind this unprecedented upheaval are far more intricate than simple piety or a singular ideological conviction. They involved a complex interplay of imperial authority, the burgeoning power of the monastic orders, and a fundamental reevaluation of what constituted sacred art itself. To fully grasp this purged past, we must delve deeper, examining the compelling hypotheses that seek to illuminate the Byzantine heart of darkness. One of the most compelling hypotheses suggests that iconoclasm was a calculated, strategic move by the Byzantine emperors to curb the immense wealth and influence of monasteries. In the Byzantine Empire, monasteries were not merely spiritual retreats. They were powerful institutions, often significant landowners, holding vast tracts of agricultural land and urban properties. This economic clout translated directly into political and social influence. Monasteries were also the primary producers of icons, employing skilled artists and artisans and benefiting enormously from the patronage of the faithful. These sacred images, central to Byzantine devotion, were not just spiritual conduits, but also valuable commodities, contributing substantially to monastic coffers. The abbots and powerful monastic orders commanded a significant following among the populace, often operating with a degree of autonomy that could, at times, rival or even openly challenge imperial authority. They represented an alternative power center, a spiritual aristocracy that could mobilize public opinion and resources independently of the emperor. An emperor, facing internal dissent or external threats, looking upon these wealthy, influential monastic complexes, producing the very objects now deemed controversial, and seeing a potential rival rather than a loyal ally. A campaign against icons, therefore, could serve a dual purpose. It could be presented as a spiritual purification, a return to what was seen as true Christian doctrine, while simultaneously undermining the economic base and popular prestige of the monasteries. By confiscating monastic lands, seizing their valuable icons, and dispersing their communities, the emperors could effectively diminish a powerful rival, centralize wealth and power back into imperial hands, and reassert their ultimate authority over both the temporal and spiritual realms. This theory casts iconoclasm not just as a theological dispute, but as a political struggle for dominance, a grand chess match between the imperial throne and the monastic orders, with the sacred images caught in the middle. The destruction of icons in this light was not solely an act of religious zeal, but also an economic and political weapon, stripping monasteries of their most visible and lucrative assets, and thus their power to challenge imperial will. A second compelling hypothesis posits that iconoclasm was primarily a theological reform driven by a renewed and literal interpretation of biblical prohibitions against graven images. The Old Testament, particularly the Ten Commandments, explicitly warns against making graven images or likenesses for worship. While early Christianity had navigated these injunctions through centuries of evolving artistic tradition, the 8th century might have seen a resurgence of stricter interpretations. This perspective suggests a genuine intellectual and spiritual movement aiming to purify Christian worship, to strip away what was perceived as a slide into idolatry, where the icon itself became an object of worship rather than a window to the divine. The theological proponents of iconoclasm argued that venerating images was a pagan practice, a regression to ancient idolatry, and that God was beyond human representation. This was not merely an internal Byzantine development. The empire existed in a complex geopolitical landscape, often interacting and frequently in conflict with the Islamic world, which held a fervent aniconic tradition. The rise of Islam, with its strict monotheism and prohibition of depicting God or prophets, might have prompted Byzantine theologians to re-examine their own practices, to ensure their faith was seen as equally pure and uncorrupted by what could be interpreted as polytheistic tendencies. Could this external religious pressure, a desire to differentiate and purify their own faith in the face of a rapidly expanding rival, have fueled the intensity of the iconoclast movement? Such an influence would explain the fervor with which the iconoclast emperors, often portrayed as deeply religious men, pursued their agenda. They might have genuinely believed they were safeguarding the spiritual integrity of the empire, protecting it from divine wrath by purging what they saw as blasphemous practices. This interpretation elevates iconoclasm beyond mere power politics, situating it within a profound intellectual and spiritual crisis over the very nature of Christian worship and the permissible boundaries of religious representation. It asks us to consider the possibility of a deep theological conviction driving an entire century of destruction. A third powerful explanation connects the rise of iconoclasm to the turbulent socio-political landscape of Byzantium, particularly in the wake of natural disasters and military defeats.
The early 8th century was a challenging period for the empire. Byzantium faced constant pressure from external enemies, particularly the expanding Arab Caliphate, leading to significant military losses and territorial contractions. Internally, the era was plagued by a series of devastating natural disasters. Earthquakes ravaged cities, volcanic eruptions cast ash across the land, and devastating plagues swept through the population. In an age deeply steeped in religious belief, such calamities were not seen as random occurrences, but as divine judgments. For many, these disasters were interpreted as God's wrath, a punishment for the sins of the empire. And what greater sin could there be in the eyes of some than the idolatry of icons? If the people believed God was punishing them for venerating images, for blurring the line between worship and adoration, then imperial intervention to suppress these images could be seen as a necessary act of appeasement. Emperors, always keen to maintain stability and legitimacy, would have been acutely aware of this popular sentiment. By endorsing or even initiating iconoclasm, they could frame themselves as righteous rulers, leading their people back to divine favor.
This theory suggests that the imperial decree to destroy icons was not merely a top-down imposition, but a response, or at least a highly effective manipulation, of deep-seated popular anxieties and superstitions. It was a calculated move to harness existing socio-political tensions and channel them into a powerful imperial policy, one that promised a return to order and divine blessing. The emperors could thus present themselves as saviors, purging the empire of its supposed spiritual ailments to ensure its survival against both natural and military threats. The interplay of popular belief, imperial opportunism, and profound societal fear creates a compelling narrative for the genesis and endurance of iconoclasm, illustrating how religious reform can be inextricably linked to the very real struggles of a nation fighting for its existence. What emerges from these compelling hypotheses is a picture far more complex than any single explanation can convey. Iconoclasm was not a monolithic movement driven by a singular motive, but a crucible where imperial authority, monastic power, theological purity, and socio-political anxieties converged and clashed. The suppression of religious imagery became intertwined with the very fabric of Byzantine society and imperial control, a tool wielded by emperors for both spiritual and pragmatic ends. This period represents a monumental struggle for the soul of an empire, a brutal ideological war fought on the canvases of holy art and within the hearts of its people. The echoes of this forgotten conflict resonate even today, shaping our understanding of religious art, the intricate relationship between church and state, and the enduring power dynamics that define faith and governance. As we piece together the fragments of this purged past, we are left not with simple answers, but with a profound appreciation for the complexities of history. The tumultuous era of iconoclasm serves as a potent reminder that the narratives we inherit are often incomplete, shaped by the victors, and that the true motives behind humanity's grandest historical movements are rarely singular or straightforward. In seeking to understand Byzantium's purge of its own sacred past, we confront questions that transcend time, questions about power, piety, and the very definition of sacred itself. What can this forbidden history teach us about the subtle ways authority can redefine truth, and how the echoes of ancient conflicts continue to shape our world long after the last icon was shattered?